name's Suzanne Grimshaw, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And as a social worker, I'm given opportunity to work with lots of different clienteles and different types of people, and I've had the opportunity to work with families that have been affected by abortion and by adoption. Well, adoption is a great and wonderful thing in a lot of ways, and so there's lots of great things that come from adoption, but there's also a lot of consequences that I think we don't necessarily think of right off the bat. We're just more concerned about the child and its finding a home. A lot of the experience that I personally have had are with friends and family and with other people that I've come into contact with who've been affected by adoption. Well, I mean, when I think of just on a personal level within my own family, we've had family members who have struggled with infertility, and they've been able to adopt children, and it's made a huge difference in their life. It gave them that child that they weren't able to conceive on their own. And oftentimes, children that are placed in adoptive homes are placed with parents that are a little bit older because they've typically been trying for several years and trying lots of different ways in which to have a child of their own and are unsuccessful. And so a lot of the parents that I've known and have worked with are a little bit older, and they're financially typically in a nice stable place when they adopt their child. Adopting a child is not an inexpensive thing. There are a lot of costs associated with adoption. Well, I think adoption makes sense in a lot of ways. Oftentimes, if someone is considering, if a birth mom is considering giving up their child for adoption, then obviously they have a lot of questions about their ability to be able to raise a child. Oftentimes, the father's not involved in that equation, and so they worry about, and they want a better life for their child than they feel like they're able to provide. So I think there's a lot of positive things that come with adoption, but there's also, I think, things that we don't necessarily think about as far as adoption's concerned, and that's sort of the emotional toll that it can have on a birth mother, and kind of that sense of loss, and oftentimes there is pressure that's placed on the birth mom, a girl who finds herself, because oftentimes they are, younger girls who find themselves with an unwanted pregnancy, and there's a lot of family pressure that can come into play too that can affect their decision whether they keep the child or place the child up for adoption. I had the opportunity to work back in Washington, D.C. I would travel to Russia quite a bit with the work that I did, and in Russia and other parts of Europe, abortions are a lot more common, and part of that is due to kind of the economic reality that a lot of people live under, and the fact that, especially in Russia, at the time when I was working back there, the government really discouraged families, and so many women had to kind of resort to abortions as a form of birth control. And there's a lot of effects that I saw that were negative because of having had, in several cases, numerous abortions, and kind of how that affected the women. And it also can, if you don't get good medical care, there can also be some negative effects later on in life when a woman and her significant other decide to have a child, and at times that can lead to infertility if you've had numerous abortions. Well, I would start by saying that I don't think anyone ever wants to have an abortion. I don't think that's the ideal. It's never the ideal thing for any woman or any girl and to have. And I certainly think that there are times when an abortion is certainly is appropriate. Oftentimes women who choose to have abortions, it isn't, I think that there's sometimes a notion that they're just doing it because they don't want to be pregnant, or that they don't want that responsibility. And I think any woman who has to choose to terminate a pregnancy has probably had a lot of, has thought long and hard about it, and it's, I don't think it would be anyone's kind of first choice. And so, but I think as far as families are concerned, especially we live here in Utah, and there's a lot of people who are religiously inclined, and you're not going to find, if a girl finds herself with an unwanted pregnancy, she's not going to find a lot of support typically for an abortion. And so that in effect though causes her to feel like that's not an option, and then she's kind of faced with carrying the baby to full term and either keeping the child or putting the child up for adoption. And oftentimes the girls are and women are just not capable or in a place to be able to really care properly for a child. And so that's when you worry about a child ending up in foster care or being abandoned, or suffering from abuse and things like that, or having to have the family, typically grandparents, really become then involved in the upbringing of the child. I think that I know of people who've had to make sort of the gut-wrenching decision about whether to carry a child to full term or not, that they know was going to not survive outside the womb. And I can't think of anything more difficult probably to face, because when you're pregnant, you can feel, at a certain point, you can feel the fetus, the infant moving around in your inside of you, and you form these bonds and things like that. And so I think having to choose to terminate a pregnancy, I can hardly imagine anything more difficult that's a woman would ever have to face. Well, my thoughts about abortion have really evolved through the years. When I was younger, I had really strong views about whether abortion was right or wrong. And as I've gotten older, I've decided that it's really a personal decision. And it's not one that I think is the ideal situation, but I don't feel like, and especially as a social worker, we're not here to judge people and their decisions. We're here to help them kind of work through and solve problems and discuss things, but ultimately it's left up to the individual to decide. And ideally, I would love to see unwanted women who are maybe facing abortion feeling like that they have options and that they have support that could help them, if they're not capable of or in a position or feel like they're ready to be a parent, that they can, place the child in an adoptive family situation. Because I also have a lot of friends who would still love to have children and they're just not able to. And I've personally known the heartache that comes with wanting to have a child and not being able to have one. And facing infertility is difficult, and it wrenches families apart. Couples who face infertility oftentimes have a much more difficult time with their marriage surviving. And so I think families are great, and that's the ideal situation, but it's not always kind of an option that a young woman feels like she faces. I think if you're interested in adopting, part of it is getting the word out to people and letting them know that you are wanting to adopt. Oftentimes, I think the best adoptions that occur are when there's a connection. And I think we all have friends on Facebook who will either see a friend or a friend of a friend who has, said that they're willing to adopt and are wanting to have a child. And so that's a good way. I'd also say save up your money, because even if you have some financial support, adopting a child is typically fairly expensive. If you go through a private agency, it can even be much more expensive, and part of that is you're paying for the expenses that come with being pregnant. And oftentimes people will provide living expenses and things like that to kind of help with that, and as well as the medical bills. As someone who had her children when I was over 30, so I'll admit that to the camera, but now it's hard to believe. But I think it used to be, and it still is, at a certain age, they kind of consider you a prime time to adopt. And I think with women marrying later in life and not even, just fertile couples putting off having their first child, I think it's kind of ridiculous that we have, that there's still in place these kind of, well, you're too old to adopt, or you're a single mom, so you shouldn't be able to adopt. I think anywhere that, a family can provide a loving home, or an individual can provide a loving home, that they should be considered for adoption.